All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us in tonight's event. My name is Joe Malbert Narvaez, and I use he and they pronouns. And I'm coming to you from the Natick Diversity and Action Center, where I serve as the Diversity and Inclusion Coordinator. I'm really excited and honored to be part of this series and assisting tonight as your facilitator. Before we begin, I would like to inform you all that this event is being recorded for those who are unable to attend. I just want to start by acknowledging that those at the Trothieta campus at Fairbanks are on the unceded customary lands of the Dene people of the Tanana River. In Nome, our colleagues are in Inupiat, Yupik, and Siberian Yupik lands. We honor the continued fight for the rights of our First Peoples, and we stand with them in solidarity and action. At UAF, we are growing into a socially just and caring institution of higher education. This ongoing speaker series, known as Shine a Light, promoting conversations on diversity, equity, and inclusion, is designed to encourage understanding, build empathy, and engage us all in thinking critically about our worldviews. This series is led by our Northwest campus, but like all great diversity efforts, there are many partnerships and collaborations. We would like to thank UAF's Department of Equity and Compliance and the Natick Diversity and Action Center for partnering with the Northwest campus to bring this series into reality. We've hosted several excellent topics throughout this series, such as discussions on Black history in Alaska, women's history with a focus on Alaska Native women. You can find these recordings at the Northwest campus website, nwc.uaf.edu. So as we celebrate the LGBTQ plus community during Pride Month, it is important for us to know where we have been in order to know where we are going. I'm really excited for tonight's discussion, which is titled Beyond Stonewall, Past and Present Movements for LGBTQ plus Equality. Our speaker tonight is Ronnie Houchin, who is the Associate Director for the Center for Student Engagement on UAF's Trothieta campus. Ronnie became involved in LGBTQ plus activism as a college student and continues to advocate for safe, supportive university communities free of harassment and discrimination. Ronnie is also the 2021-2022 UAF Staff Council President. Please welcome Ronnie Houchin.
Thanks, Joe, for that great introduction. And thanks to everyone else who's tuned in this evening. I'm really excited to be here, and I feel really honored to be a part of this Shine a Light speaker series. Yeah, we'll just dive in. Joe already gave a great land acknowledgement, but I do want to share that for folks who maybe don't know the land stewardship of the lands you are on, you can visit native-land.ca, type in your city or your zip code, and find out whose lands you are on. There's also a really great resource at this link, and I'll try to put these links in the chat for folks who maybe are unfamiliar with what a land acknowledgement is, or if you're looking for resources to create a land acknowledgement for your own organization. nativegov.org has really great resources on land acknowledgements. So as we begin, I want to start with a couple of shared assumptions for all of us here in this space. One is that we're all here to learn, and so that I hope that all of us have open minds and are willing to accept information, maybe have some of our knowledge or beliefs or assumptions challenged by the information that I'll be sharing today. And also, I want to assume that we all believe in equality. This isn't a space where I'm going to debate anyone about the validity of LGBTQ rights or history. I'm just going to assume that we are all here because we believe in equality for LGBTQ folks, and that we want to learn more and become better allies and advocates. So I want to share with you all a little about who I am and why I am here. My name is Ronnie Houchin, pronouns are he, him, his. I grew up in a very small town in Southeast Indiana called New Trenton. This is the entire town. All 160 or so people who live in New Trenton are depicted here in this photo from Google Earth. And it was a really conservative, homogenous community, very, very Christian, very white. and in, in our schools, we weren't taught LGBTQ history. We were taught history from a very Western white perspective. And so, growing up, I didn't have a whole lot of models of what it meant to be queer. Most of what I learned in my earlier years came from the Jerry Springer Show. Not the best example of tolerance or equality for the LGBTQ community on the Jerry Springer Show. Is very salacious, very dramatic, and relied on a lot of really negative stereotypes and tropes. Fun fact, Jerry Springer was the mayor of Cincinnati, the next big city. So before he got his nationally syndicated talk show, I would see Jerry Springer on the news. He was mayor and then a news anchor on one of the local news stations. So Jerry Springer was a part of my life for far too long. But towards the end of my teenage years, there were I did manage to find some positive depictions of LGBTQ culture. My friends and I, once we got our driver's license, we would drive an hour and a half to another city where there was a bookstore that had a very small sort of LGBTQ literature section that we were just really enamored with. Learned a lot from those very few books on those bookstore shelves. But also some shifts began to happen in the media. Like Will and Grace came on air in the late 90s. Started to see some positive depictions of LGBTQ folks in the media. But it wasn't until I went to college that I really began to understand that as queer folks, we have a rich culture and rich history. As a college student, I became involved with our gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender student support services office as a peer mentor. I became a gender studies major, and through those experiences, again, just really learned about things like Stonewall and, about some of the other things I'll talk about later in the presentation, but that being gay, being trans, being queer wasn't this new thing that had just sort of happened in the latter half of the 20th century. But again, that there was this rich history and rich culture and really long struggle for equality and rights. Today I work here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I'm the Associate Director in the Center for Student Engagement. Been in Alaska a decade now. I had the pleasure of working with Joe and others here in the Center for Student Engagement, doing co-curricular programming for students. And I also live here in Fairbanks with my husband, Andrew. We've been married a little over a year. And back when I was a college student, prior to the Obergefell versus Hodges decision, I never imagined that I would ever be able to be legally married. And so it's still kind of strange for me to say that word husband, but very exciting. So the concepts that we use today around gender and sexuality are really pretty modern concepts, right? And pretty Western constructs. It wasn't until the late 1800s that we started seeing words like homosexual, in other words that today are pretty common for gender and sexual identities. But really, they're fairly modern, less than 200 years old now, some of these terms and concepts. They grew out of psychology. But again, I just kind of want to emphasize that, these terms and identities that we have now are pretty modern. And I came across this quote from a study through the National Park Foundation back in 2016. And this Megan Spraingate says, as a queer archaeologist, it is tempting to look for myself and other LGBTQ and Two-Spirit people just as we are today in the past, to legitimize our existence by proving that we have always existed. And yet, to paraphrase Barb Voss, we need to be wary of projects that essentialize sexual and gender identities by using archaeology to create a lineage of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and queer forefathers and foremothers, and transgender foreparents for present-day identities. I think this is a really important thing for us to keep in mind. I said that these identities that we have, the word homosexual didn't even appear in print until the late 1800s. It can be really tempting to look back through history and want to apply these concepts to ancient peoples and in non-Western cultures. But it's unfair, and it's not really ethical either to apply our modern identities and our Western identities to ancient, non-Western folks. So that's something I just kind of want to plant out there, and hope that we can all keep in mind as I start to talk about queer history through the years. That when we look back at ancient China, ancient Greece, ancient Islamic cultures, we can see instances of same-sex romantic love or physical attraction or relationships or marriage even, or folks living outside of the gender binary and performing roles in their culture that might have typically been associated for individuals of the opposite sex, and again want to apply our modern Western concepts to them, but it's not really valid to do that. So just want to keep those things in mind. So the title of the presentation is Beyond Stonewall. And so we'll start with Stonewall so we can move beyond it. I remember being really surprised to learn about Stonewall. And, I learned about it in the early 2000s. It really wasn't that long ago. And I'm still surprised today to meet folks, especially young queer folks who don't know what Stonewall is. So I thought we'll start with Stonewall, and then we'll kind of move around it and learn about LGBTQ history and fights for rights outside of Stonewall. So back in June 28th, 1969, the New York City Police raided the Stonewall Inn. And these kinds of raids were pretty common for gay bars, not just in New York City, but really all over the country. And it was also really common for these bars to be really unsanctioned sorts of places, right? So Stonewall didn't have a liquor license, it didn't have running water, didn't have an emergency exit, only had the one entrance or exit. And it was owned by the mafia, actually. The mob owned Stonewall. And so the police would often tip off the owners in advance of their raid. Typically, they would hold these raids in the daylight hours when the bars were, fairly empty. But for whatever reason, on June 28th, 1969, the police didn't give the owners of the Stonewall Inn advance notice that they were going to raid the bar. And they also raided it at night when the bar was going to be, more full of patrons. And a little bit more context around Stonewall is it was located, it still exists today. It's located in Greenwich Village. And Greenwich Village, starting around World War II, became home to a lot of gay men and lesbians. A lot of that had to do with World War II, right? So folks from rural America go off, serve in the military, often meet folks who are, like them, and find out about places like New York, San Francisco, other port cities that at that time had grown, fairly large queer communities. Some of those folks who had sort of settled in those cities were there not by choice, right? So there were these things called blue discharges that were in use in World War I and World War II, especially, where if a service member was found out to be gay, they were given a blue discharge. It was called blue because it was on blue paper, and those folks would be dismissed from the military and sent back to a port city. Often these folks, concerned about the shame that they would face from their home communities if they went home, would just stay in whatever port city that they were sent to. So cities like New York, San Francisco, LA, others grew these sort of nascent LGBTQ communities, Greenwich Village being one of those in New York City. And then into the 1950s, sort of the counterculture movement was also centered in some of these cities like Greenwich Village. And there were, the beat poets like Allen Ginsberg and William S. Burroughs, who wrote about sexuality and homosexuality and promoted anarchy and drug use, also drew like-minded folks to these communities. So Greenwich Village had a fairly, large, thriving queer community. So anyway, June 28th, 1969, the police raided the Stonewall Inn. And in these raids, they would ask for folks' identification. If folks' gender presentation didn't match the gender or the sex marker that was on their documentation, they could be arrested. And so this night, patrons who were dressed as women refused to show that documentation. They refused to be searched to verify their sex. And I should also say the Stonewall was most popularly frequented by gay men. Some lesbians would go, but it was mostly gay men. So patrons dressed as women refused to be searched, refused to provide their identification. Other men did the same, and the situation escalated. A crowd gathered, the patrons of the bar began fighting back. Folks came out of, neighboring apartment buildings and joined the riots. And, it's said that, well, even though the Stonewall riots were covered by the media, there's not a whole lot of official documentation from that night. So no one knows for sure who started the riot. Sort of pop culture mythology states that a lesbian, Stormy, oh gosh, I'm dropping her last name. She was a butch Black woman, Black lesbian, threw the first punch. Other lore states that Miss Major, another Black trans woman, threw her shoe. It's also been attributed to Marsha P. Johnson. We don't exactly know what happens, but it's what's interesting to me in all of these stories is that it's Black women who lead the fight and start the fight. But at any rate, the riots persisted through the night. Really catalyzed the LGBTQ movement at the time. The following year in 1970, there was a march to commemorate the riot, which was the very first Pride March that continues today. I do want to share this photo of Marsha P. Johnson there on the left and Sylvia Rivera on the right, two folks who were there at Stonewall, participated in the riot, participated in the early LGBTQ rights movement. Sylvia Rivera, in response to the riots was quoted as saying, "You've been treating us like shit all these years. Now it's our turn." It was one of the greatest moments of my life, she said. One of the really tragic things to me is that both of these pioneers really in the LGBTQ rights movement were excluded from the movement in later years by cis white gay men, as were so many trans women and other queer people of color in the early parts of the movement. So Stonewall is probably our most prominent event or moment in the LGBTQ rights movement, but it's not the start of queer history. It's not the start of queer culture, and it certainly wasn't the end. So kind of want to take us on a little trip through history to talk about LGBTQ history, and then towards the end, we'll talk a little more specifically about rights movements as they're happening today. So in prehistory, we do find depictions of gender variance or relationships that exist outside of what we would consider the norm. Hate that word, but we consider the norm. So for example, in Mesolithic rock art in Sicily, and the Mesolithic was a period that in Europe lasted from 15,000 to 5,000 years ago. And there's rock art in caves in Sicily that depict, these phallic male figures in pairs. And, we don't know for sure what that was meant to depict, but some scholars have interpreted them as, as a depiction of male intercourse, all the way back from 15,000 to 5,000 years ago. We also have this figurine, the Ayin Sakri lovers, that was discovered near Bethlehem in Israel. It is considered to be about 11,000 years old. And it is the oldest known representation of two individuals engaged in sexual intercourse. And what's really notable about this figurine is that the sex of the genders, or the sex of the two figures, isn't clear. And scholars have debated various things, but I think it's pretty amazing that we have this piece of art that's 11,000 years old, first of all, but second of all, it's not clearly gendered. Archaeologists found outside of Prague in the Czech Republic a burial site from about 2900 to 2500 BCE that is a male skeleton dressed in an outfit that was typically reserved for women of that culture. And so some archaeologists speculate that burial corresponds to someone that we might think of today as transgender, or of a third gender. And then throughout the Mediterranean and that area of the world, Neolithic and Bronze Age drawings and figurines that have been found depict, humans having sex characteristics of both sexes. So here's a drawing of a figurine that was found in the Mediterranean, of a figure that has breasts and a phallus. So we can see even in prehistory depictions of what we might think of today as transgender folks or same-sex intercourse. Then, of course, we can look at various ancient empires and find numerous examples. So, for example, in ancient Egypt, there was at least one pharaoh who was known to have a male lover, and it was written about. And in a later tale, also in ancient Egypt, these two folks depicted in this art from their tomb were both men, and their names were, I'm going to mispronounce these wildly, Khnumhotep and Nian-Khnum. They were two royal servants. They were both men. They were buried together in a joint tomb and are sometimes considered to be the first recorded same-sex couple in ancient history. This image from their tomb, we can see all of their children behind them. And while they had wives, their wives aren't depicted in that image. And so what's, again, what's notable is that, these were two men who were buried together in a tomb. And of course, in ancient Greece, numerous, from the literature from ancient Greece, numerous different concepts of same-sex relationships, same-sex sexual intercourse. The ancient Greeks didn't really conceive of sexual orientation as a social identifier in the way we do today. And they viewed, they distinguished sexual desire and activity not so much by the gender of the individuals involved, but by the role that they played during sex. And in ancient Greek culture, dominance was correlated with masculinity and was seen as being more valued. Also in ancient Greece, there was the common practice of pederasty, where older men would take boys as lovers, and it was seen as a pedagogical tool for these older men to show affection and interest in these boys and to teach them, philosophy and other various things. And we see more examples of male, romantic or physical love or activity in ancient Greece than we do between women, and that's really true of all sort of historic and ancient cultures. I think primarily because it's men who played the more valued role in many cultures, and especially in Western culture, and men are the ones who most often held power, either in their family unit or in their society. And so we just have more record of men than we do women. But ancient Greece did give us Sappho, who's depicted on this urn. She was a poet. She lived on the island of Lesbos, and she wrote sort of love poetry. about women. From Lesbos, we have the term lesbian. From Sappho, we have the term sapphic, which is sometimes used to refer to, female love. Moving on into ancient Rome, again, it was quite common in ancient Rome for men to have sex with other men, and there are even prominent examples of men marrying other men. Some Roman emperors even held public marriages to other men. Emperor Nero held 2 public weddings to men. And so again, we find this sort of same-sex men having sex with men as fairly common in ancient Rome. Fewer examples of women doing the same, but again, our historical documentation of women and their roles in society are fewer than that of men. And then in China, there's documentation of same-sex relationships and same-sex romantic and physical attraction since at least 600 BCE. And was, up until contact with Islamic and Christian traders, missionaries, explorers, doesn't seem to be a whole lot of stigma around it. But once the West started to become in contact with China, spreading Christian and Muslim values, there's a shift in China in how same-sex relationships are viewed. But we do still continue to see depictions. This image here is from from somewhere around, I think, the early 1700s, and it's a woman sort of spying on 2 male lovers. So even after sort of that contact with the West and the spread of Christian and Islamic values, we still continue to see examples of same-sex relationships and sort of folks performing gender roles outside of the binary in ancient China. Of course, around the world, many other indigenous perspectives on gender and sexuality, and everywhere that colonizers have gone, they've encountered relationships, behaviors, and identities that today we might classify under that broader LGBTQ umbrella. So to share a few examples, in something like 155 indigenous North American cultures, we find examples of folks performing roles of the opposite sex or gender. Today, many Native activists have sort of reclaimed the term Two-Spirit to identify those folks. But we find these, again, from the earliest colonization of the Americas, Western explorers encountered these folks, often treated them very poorly, right? So these Western explorers from Europe, just generally saw indigenous Americans as uncivilized and savage, and saw as part of their mission to colonize the Americas, not only to claim land and the wealth that comes with those lands, but also to spread their ideas of civilization that were very much rooted in Catholicism or other forms of Christianity that at that time had come to prescribe very specific gender roles, very specific rules around relationships and sex. And so these folks and these Native American cultures that were sort of falling outside of those expectations were really puzzling and challenging for the explorers, and I think added to their propaganda of the people who were living in the Americas at the time. Specifically, in our context, in Alaska, many Alaska Native cultures have terms for Two-Spirit folks. They're well attested in the literature, and again, for Native American cultures and Alaska Native cultures, there's a movement today, and over the past few decades, for individuals to reclaim these identities. Yeah, lots of information out there if you're interested in learning more. In India, ancient Hindu and Vedic texts contain many descriptions of their deities transcending gender norms and manifesting multiple combinations of sex and gender. The Kama Sutra talks of same-sex love and sexual behavior. There's a long tradition of hijra in India, today, in today's terms, we might view those folks as transgender, but again, that's a very Western concept, and I think even within India and Bangladesh and the subcontinent, they prefer that term hijra. Folks who are assigned male at birth but perform the roles of women in society and adopt, traditionally female gender expression. And then throughout Indonesia and Oceania, many cultures had same-sex relationships as integral parts of their culture until the middle of the 1900s. Same is true of Africa. In Africa, while many cultures and societies were influenced by Islam before European colonization, we do still find historical accounts of same-sex relationships in many African cultures, and individuals again living lives outside of that gender binary. Oh, and this is an image I found on Instagram recently that I really loved. Indigenous queerness is older than settler states and not a colonial consequence, but tradition in the flesh, which to me just really speaks to the fact that, Indigenous cultures around the world have held space for what we might term today as queer identities, but it was really settler colonialism and the forced imposition of Western values that sought to extinguish those identities. But again, movements today to reclaim those identities. So I've mentioned a couple of times sort of the spread of Christianity and Islam and how those were tied with colonization and imperialism. And there are so many contradictions in that, right? So we can look at the Catholic Church, for example, in the Renaissance, sort of at the peak of exploration, the official, teachings of the church that, homosexuality was a sin, that same-sex, behavior was a sin, was an official teaching. And however, the Catholic Church supported artists like Leonardo da Vinci, who is well known to have had sexual and romantic relationships with other men. Islam has a long history of, literature and poetry, men writing love poems to other men. And so, within sort of the spread of Christianity and the spread of Islam, contradictions between official teachings and the teachings that were forced upon Indigenous people and the history of those faiths. In the Renaissance, there was this really anti-pagan sort of philosophy, and the Christians in the Renaissance, Catholics, pretty much everyone was Catholic in the Renaissance, I think, saw anything outside of that as pagan. And so there was, again, that fueled this idea of exploration and expansion and imperialism that, spread Christianity and Islam throughout the world, and the values associated with Christianity and Islam, again, being imposed upon the Indigenous people. So if we kind of skip ahead a little bit to past the Renaissance and into the 1600s and 1700s, we see the rise of the Enlightenment, which was an intellectual and philosophical movement of the 16 and 1700s. The Enlightenment emphasized reason, liberty, tolerance, the separation of church and state. The Enlightenment was one of the things that heavily influenced the American Revolution. The Enlightenment undermined monarchies and the Catholic Church, and really influenced folks to advocate for self-determination. And so the Enlightenment contributed to the spread of democracy, the rise of scientific thinking, finding the scientific method and finding proof for things, just the rise of science. It was really connected with the abolition of slavery, the rise of women's rights, and so kind of set the stage for the late 1800s for some advancements in LGBTQ rights, which I'll get in a second. At the same time, the rise of scientific thinking, urban areas became safer as folks realized, that germs caused disease, not bad spirits or miasma, and along with the Industrial Revolution, led to urbanization. In the mid to late 1800s, we have folks living in cities in greater numbers, and that had a real impact on the very nascent LGBTQ rights movement of the time, because you might have been the only person who was attracted to folks of the same sex in your tiny town in rural England. But with the Industrial Revolution and the draw of folks to working in factories and cities, it increased the likelihood that you might meet someone like you. And so with the Industrial Revolution and corresponding urbanization, we start to see, these very small queer communities sprouting up in cities, in major cities across the world, especially in Europe and in the Americas, bringing folks together to meet and to share their stories and to begin to apply these principles of the Enlightenment to their own selves and their own identities. In 1867, this fella, Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, who was German, a pioneer of the gay rights movement, and is sometimes considered to be the first person to really come out in history, right? So in the 1860s, he wrote a number of essays that made the bold claim of the time that same-sex love was natural. And in these essays, he created his own terms for men who were in love with other men, and women who would fall in love and want to have sex with women, and also bisexuals and intersex folks. He created this whole lexicon. But he did this sort of anonymously. But in 1867, he came out and spoke publicly in defense of homosexuality at a meeting of the Congress of German Jurists. These were folks who were debating the criminality of homosexual behavior. And so he came out as the author of these essays, came out as his term for gay. And then 2 years later, another activist at the time, Karl Maria Kertbeny, who was Hungarian, created this term homosexual in a letter that he and Karl Heinrich Ulrichs were pen pals. They corresponded. And so Karl Maria Kertbeny coined this term homosexual in a letter to Karl Heinrich Ulrichs. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Germany, thanks to folks like Karl Heinrich Ulrichs and Magnus Hirschfeld, who founded an early institute into the study of sexual behavior, really established Berlin and Germany as a global center for the LGBTQ rights movement and LGBTQ culture. This bar here, the El Dorado, was in Berlin, and is sort of the model for the bar in Cabaret, and the musical and film Cabaret. A very active, queer life in Berlin at the turn of the last century. And we also see a number of public figures in the earliest 20th century, in the early 1900s, who were open about their same-sex attraction or same-sex sexual activities. Huge movie stars like Marlene Dietrich or Mae West and others who were, celebrities of their day. And it was, no secret that these were folks who were homosexual or bisexual. But then we move into the 1930s, and in the 1930s we see sort of a global depression, a global economic depression, and in that, many nations were looking to put the blame on folks, and the Nazis were rose to power in Germany in the 1930s and put the blame for Germany's economic depression on folks that they didn't consider to be true Germans, right? So of course that included Jewish folks, but it also included, political dissidents. It included the Romney people, and it included homosexuals, right? So this is an image from a concentration camp that shows the signifiers that were sewn onto folks' sleeves. And on the right there, the pink triangle, that column with homosexuel written above it, those were markers that were given to gay men who were taken to concentration camps. Women typically were given a black triangle. They viewed them more under like the political dissident sort of category than homosexual. And so gay men, pink triangle, gay women, black triangle. Later these were reclaimed by the queer community. The pink and the black were combined to make lavender, and the triangle is flipped upside down to become a symbol of the LGBTQ community. Anyway, we see the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s, working to dismantle this idea of Germany as a center for queer culture. In the States, we see the Hays Code come into effect. That was officially called the Motion Picture Production Code. It was in place from 1934 to 1968, and it was voluntary censorship by the film industry. Prior to 1934, in films, we would find depictions of same-sex love and attraction. But with the growing conservatism in the United States, the motion picture industry decided to self-censor, sort of head off the government. There were some pushes within state legislatures and the national legislature to censor films. And among the things in the Hays Code, there was no miscegenation, there was no, romantic or physical relationships of folks from different races. A kiss couldn't last longer than 3 seconds. And of course, no explicit homosexuality. Although we do, see in films, of that era, characters that are coded queer, often portraying villains or pretty unsavory characters. I already talked about blue discharges, the discharges that were given to service members, particularly in World War II, if they were discovered to be gay. The conservatism continued after World War II, with McCarthyism, and folks might be familiar with the Red Scare, this idea that communists were infiltrating the government. At the same time, there was something called the Lavender Scare, this idea that homosexuals were infiltrating public service in the government. And so there was a campaign to not only root out communists, but also to root out gays and lesbians from public service and from the government. The idea being that they would be subject, really easy subjects for blackmail and things like that. 1950s, Alfred Kinsey carried out his research. He was a researcher at my alma mater, Indiana University. He did interviews with his team and looked at sexual behavior among men and women. Sometimes when we hear the statistic that 10% of the population is gay, that's related to Kinsey's work, who found that roughly 10% of the people he interviewed were exclusively or primarily engaging in sexual intercourse with folks of the same sex. He also gave us the Kinsey scale, which is a scale from 0 to 6, 0 being exclusively heterosexual, 6 being exclusively homosexual. Caused a big stir when his research was published. Christine Jorgensen was probably the first real prominent trans person in American society. She caused a big stir, was on the cover of tabloids and newspapers when she received gender confirmation surgery and began living life as a woman, was on talk shows, had her own variety show. Alan Turing is another prominent figure from World War II. He's considered the father of computer science. He was a gay man who was found guilty in England of being gay and sentenced. Was given the choice of prison or basically chemical castration, and instead chose to die by suicide. And then in 1952, the American Psychological Association listed homosexuality as a disease. They classified it as a sociopathic personality disturbance. A psychologist named Evelyn Hooker undertook studies in the 1950s. She believed that the correlation between homosexuality and mental illness was false, and she carried out studies to prove this. She published her work in 1957, was instantly became sort of an icon and hero of the queer community, but it wouldn't be until 1974, I believe, that the American Psychological Association would remove homosexuality as a disease from the DSM. I'm realizing I'm running short on time, so I'm going to try to get through some of the rest of the stuff really quick. So we talked about Stonewall as sort of the most prominent queer uprising, but there were many others throughout history. Eve's Hangout was a bar in New York. It was raided in 1926 and forced to close after the owner was found guilty of obscenity and disorderly conduct. It was a lesbian bar. Cooper Donuts was in downtown LA. It was located between 2 gay bars. And at the time in LA, it was illegal for a person's gender presentation to not match the gender on their ID. So trans folks in particular were often targeted and arrested by the police. And many gay bars were hostile to trans patrons because they feared that they would draw police to their bars for raids. So in Cooper Donuts in 1959, police entered, asked for IDs, tried to arrest 2 drag queens, 2 male sex workers, and a gay man. Onlookers began throwing coffee, donuts, cups, and trash at the police, eventually drove off the police, and they didn't get to make any arrests. Compton's Cafeteria a year later, in 1966, so 7 years later, in San Francisco, it was a common gathering place for transgender folks, especially trans women, but the staff weren't so accommodating of those individuals and would sometimes call the police on their patrons. They did in 1966. In August of 1966, a trans woman resisted arrest, threw her coffee at the police. Other patrons joined in. The riots continued to the next day. Didn't get a whole lot of media coverage. There's not a whole lot of documentation around the Compton's Cafeteria riot. The next year at the Black Cat Tavern, plainclothes police officers infiltrated the tavern, began beating and arresting patrons. And a riot didn't actually occur that night, just sort of some resistance. But in a month later, in February of 1967, they did hold a protest, sort of protesting that treatment. So other movements beyond Stonewall, sort of corresponding also with the broader civil rights movement that was happening in the United States at the time. I'm going to breeze through my next few slides here. There's a lot that happens sort of post Stonewall, right? The LGBTQ rights movement really begins picking up steam. We see 1972, East Lansing and Ann Arbor, Michigan, and San Francisco adopt homosexual rights ordinances. 1973, homosexuality was removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychological Association, no longer considered a disease. In 1975, Cleo Rorex issued the first same-sex marriage licenses in Boulder County, Colorado. Those were subsequently invalidated. The rainbow flag was created in 1978. 1980, the Human Rights Campaign, probably the largest and most prominent LGBTQ rights organization in the United States, was founded. The first official documentation of AIDS by the CDC in 1981. And of course, with the AIDS epidemic, no real official response or even recognition from the government at the time. Lots of misunderstanding and stigma around the AIDS epidemic. 1989, Denmark became the first country to allow registered same-sex partnerships, something that wouldn't happen in the United States for at least another decade. Lots of stuff happens in the 90s, again, really picking up steam. Some really great stuff, like in 1992, Althea Garrison elected as the first transgender state legislature in America, but also not so great stuff like Don't Ask, Don't Tell. In 1999, the first domestic partnerships in the US came into effect. Lots happening in the 2000s as well. One of the things that many people perceive as the most impactful event in the LGBTQ rights movement is the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015 in the Obergefell versus Hodges decision of the Supreme Court, which declared marriage equality nationwide. But as the fight for equal marriage ramped up in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, it was really a fight that was led by white cis folks, particularly white cis gay men, who sought for marriage. And many queer and trans communities of color saw this as prioritizing something that only benefited a minority of the overall queer culture, right? Like, what good is marriage if you can't get a job, you can't get healthcare, you don't have access to housing, where a lot of the arguments around equal marriage and the fight for equal marriage within the LGBTQ community. And then recently, last year in 2020, Bostock versus Clayton County is a Supreme Court decision that prohibited discrimination in employment nationwide. And one of the things that I found pretty spectacular about that decision is that Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote, "It is impossible to discriminate against a person for being homosexual or transgender without discriminating against that individual based on sex." So prior civil rights legislation had already determined that it was illegal to discriminate against a person on the basis of sex. And we've seen in some district courts, appellate courts, and in the Supreme Court, sort of the returning to this idea that discrimination based on sex also covers discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation. So lots has happened, but lots still needs to happen. And this is where, I'm hoping that all of us here today think about what sort of action we want to take to advance LGBTQ equality. So the Equality Act is a bill in the United States Congress that, if it's passed, would amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity in employment, housing, public accommodations, education, federally funded programs, credit, and jury service. So the Supreme Court's ruling in Bostock versus Clayton County addressed part of that, the employment piece. But there's still, across the country, many states where it's still legal to discriminate in housing and education and other areas on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. So we see here, Alaska is a state with no statewide LGBT non-discrimination protections. So in Alaska, it's still illegal to discriminate against an individual in housing or healthcare based off of their gender identity or sexual orientation. The act was reintroduced back in February and passed by the House with support from all the Democrats and 3 Republicans. It's currently with the Senate Judiciary Committee awaiting debate. And of course, to overcome a filibuster and become law, it would need all of the Democrats to support it, plus 10 Republicans, and it's sort of unclear if it's going to pass the Senate. Something that I'll mention is it's fairly recent. The Department of Health and Human Services now interprets a part of the Affordable Care Act covers or prohibits discrimination in healthcare based off of sexual orientation and gender identity. However, the Trump administration's guidance around that is still on the books, and it's unclear exactly how that Health and Human Services guidance is going to be interpreted by various healthcare providers without a final rule from the Biden administration, which still could take some time. Of course, there was a Supreme Court case decision last week around adoption rights. It's still not legal in all cases for LGBTQ folks to adopt. Religious, faith-based, faith-affiliated adoption agencies can still discriminate against same-sex couples. And then, of course, trans rights are under attack nationwide. I don't even know at this point how many legislative bodies, state legislatures have introduced anti-trans legislation to put restrictions on bathroom use, to put restrictions on transgender youth participating in sports. It seems to have become sort of the cause of many conservative lawmakers around the country to restrict the rights of trans individuals in our nation. Of course, globally, the picture is mixed. Same-sex intercourse is still illegal in many countries around the world. At least Iran still has the death penalty for individuals found engaging in same-sex intercourse. So, in much of the Western world, our advocacy has led to a broad expansion of LGBTQ rights, but that's not the case in many other areas of the world, unfortunately. So as I mentioned before, most of our LGBTQ rights movement up until now has really centered on white, cis individuals, in particular gay men. And so we're long overdue for centering the most marginalized of our community in the LGBTQ rights movement, right? So transgender folks are under attack. Trans rights are under attack. We know that trans women of color are subject to highly disproportionate rates of violence. We know that trans children are under attack, again, with various legislatures enacting anti-trans legislation. We know that queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are subject to disproportionate rates of all kinds of violence. And we know that LGBTQ youth die by suicide in disproportionate rates compared to their heterosexual and transgender or cisgender peers. So again, for a long time, marriage was seen as the fight. But I believe that, in any of our fights for rights, whether it's, we're fighting the epidemic of sexual violence, or we're advocating for affordable housing for our unhoused neighbors, whatever the fight is, we have to center the most marginalized folks, and we also have to consider how those movements, how those struggles, those fights are including the queer community. So as I approach the end here, I just really encourage you to take whatever action is comfortable for you, right? We couldn't have achieved what we have achieved in the LGBTQ rights movement if it was just us queers engaging in the fight. Our straight and cis siblings, colleagues, family members, friends have aided tremendously in this fight. So to the allies here, thank you for that. But to continue the action, continue to learn. I'm always still learning. I'm not an expert in any of this. I'm always learning more about what I can do and learning how to be a better ally for my own community. So continue going to presentations like this. read books, you know, continue learning. Sometimes the best way to learn is to engage with someone, right? Someone that you care about, someone who you can be open with and learn from. Of course, vote if you're able to, and if that's something that you know, engage in. Vote for pro-LGBTQ candidates at every level. Donate to organizations who are doing the work, and advocate. You know, and sometimes, you know, advocating means calling your legislator. Sometimes it means joining a protest, joining a rally. Sometimes advocacy is done, you know, in our homes by having conversations with our loved ones about why equality and LGBTQ rights are important to us. To me, it doesn't matter what you do, just that you do something. This fight isn't over. There's still lots more work to be done. So please just do whatever feels comfortable for you and within your scope. You know, when I think about how much work still needs to be done and how I'm just one person, I think about this quote from Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." So hopefully that can ground you and maybe serve as something you can think back to when you're faced or with a challenging situation, or you feel called to take some sort of action in improving equality. Hopefully that can empower you. So that's all I got. I think I see some questions and some items in the chat that I haven't been able to attend to. So Joe, I'll bring you back to help me work through those things.
Thank you so much, Ronnie, for your time and for presenting in tonight's event. I know that we are at the hour mark, but if it's okay with you, we can just address a couple of questions and then we'll go from there. Sound good? Okay, so the first question that we got from an audience member is, there have been decades-long effort to transform curriculum in American elementary and secondary schools to be inclusive and authentic, rather than commemorative and inculcating with persistent instruction to implant attitudes. Are there countries where there is authentic and inclusive teachings and learning other than at the university level?
It's a really great question. I am not a K-12 educator, so don't feel super equipped to answer this, but I do know that some states, California in particular, have include LGBTQ history in the K-12 curriculum. So I would maybe look at California as an example of that. Yeah, definitely more work needs to be done there. You know, I think it's a shame that I didn't learn about Stonewall until I was in my 20s, and it's a shame to me that I regularly encounter college students who've never learned about Stonewall. So I hope that more and more schools and school districts begin incorporating more histories, including LGBTQ histories, in the curriculum.
Thank you. And a follow-up question to that is, and this question is from P. Penny, what can those of us who have lived some of this history help you make progress on these fronts?
That is a great question. And, you know, I think it's a really important one. You know, the AIDS epidemic took so many of our elders away from us, folks who lived through Stonewall, lived through the 1970s. And I think as I have sort of gotten a little bit older myself, I've come to really recognize the value of our queer elders in being knowledge bearers and culture bearers. And so, you know, for young queers out there, I really encourage you to find a queer elder and to learn the history from folks who lived it. I mean, even just the 90s when I grew up is so different than how things are now. And so, you know, for Pete, I hope that you, you know, share your story with folks, and, you know, for queer youth, you know, please do what I didn't and seek out queer elders to learn our history and culture.
Thank you, Ronnie. And just one last question that we got. So this question is from Mariah. I was creating a survey recently and wanted to include different pronouns for students to choose from, but didn't realize how many gender pronouns there actually were. How would you recommend asking this question? And should I include all pronouns even if I'm going to ask the question?
It's a great question. I think a best practice for forms and things like that is just to include a blank line for folks to write down, whether it's their gender identity, pronouns. Give them the opportunity to not have to select from a prescribed list of things that may or may not encapsulate their identity, but allow folks to tell you how they prefer, what their pronouns are.
Awesome. All right. Well, Ronnie, thank you so much again for your time. And for everybody who joined us, thank you for being here this evening in our celebration of Pride. So please keep an eye out for upcoming topics through our Shine a Light speaker series at nwc.uaf.edu or follow the Northwest Campus on Facebook. And if you'd like to share the recording or give feedback, you can do so by visiting the courses tab at nwc.uaf.edu. All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night and happy Pride.